The Lame Dog. Once upon a time there lived a king, like many others. He had 3 daughters, who were young and beautiful to such a degree that it would have been difficult to have found handsomer maidens. Yet there was a great difference among them, for the 2 older sisters were haughty in their thoughts and manners, while the youngest was sweet and friendly, and everyone liked her. Besides, she was fair as the day and delicate as the snow, and far more beautiful than either of her sisters. One day the king's daughters were sitting together in their room, and their talk happened to turn on their husbands-to-be. The oldest said, "If I ever marry, my husband must have golden hair and a golden beard." And the second exclaimed, "And mine must have silver hair and a silver beard." But the youngest princess held her tongue and said nothing. Then her sisters asked her whether she did not want to wish for a husband. "No," she answered, "but if fate should give me a husband, I will be content to take him as he is, and were he no more than a lame dog." Then the 2 other princesses laughed and joked about it, and told her the day might easily come when she would change her mind. But many speak truth and do not know it. Thus it chanced with the king's daughters, since before the year had come to an end, each had the suitor for whom she had wished. A man with golden hair and golden beard sued for the oldest princess and won her consent to his suit. And a man with silver hair and a silver beard sued for the second, and she became his bride. But the youngest princess had no other suitor than a lame dog. Then she recalled her talk with her sisters in their room, and thought to herself, "May God aid me in the marriage into which I must enter." Yet she would not break the word she had once passed, but followed her sister's example, and accepted the dog. The wedding lasted a number of days, and was celebrated with great pomp and splendor. But while the guests danced and amused themselves, the youngest princess sat apart and wept, and when the others were laughing, her tears flowed till it made one sad to see them. After the wedding, the newly married pairs were each to drive off to their castle, and the 2 older princesses each drove off in a splendidly decorated coach, with a large retinue and all sorts of honors. But the youngest had to go afoot, since her husband, the dog, had neither coach nor driver. When they had wandered long and far, they came to a great forest, so great that it seemed endless. But the dog limped along in advance, and the king's daughter followed after, weeping. And as they went along, she suddenly saw a magnificent castle lying before them, and round about it were beautiful meadows and green woods, all of them most enjoyable to see. The princess stopped and asked to whom the great mansion might belong. "That," said the dog, "is our home. We will live here, and you shall rule it as you see fit." Then the maiden laughed amid her tears, and could not overcome her surprise at all she saw. The dog added, "I have but a single request to make to you, and that you must not refuse to grant." "What is your request?" asked the princess. "You must promise me," said the dog, "that you will never look at me while I am asleep. Otherwise you are free to do whatever you wish." The princess gladly promised to grant his request, and so they went to the great castle. And if the castle was magnificent from without, it was still more magnificent within. It was so full of gold and silver that the precious metals gleamed from every corner, and there was such abundance of supplies of every kind, and of so many other things, that everything in the world one might have wished to have was already there. The princess spent the livelong day running from one room to another, and each was handsomer than the one she had just entered. But when evening came and she went to bed, the dog crept into his own, and then she noticed that he was not a dog, but a human being. Yet she said not a word, because she remembered her promise, and did not wish to cross her husband's will. Thus some time passed. The princess dwelt in the beautiful castle and had everything her heart might desire, but every day the dog ran off and did not reappear until it was evening and the sun had set. Then he returned home, and was always so kind and friendly that it would have been a fine thing had other men done half as well. The princess now began to feel a great affection for him, and quite forgot he was only a lame dog, for the proverb says, "Love is blind." Yet time passed slowly, because she was so much alone, and she often thought of visiting her sisters and seeing how they were. She spoke of it to her husband, and begged his permission to make the journey. No sooner had the dog heard her wish than he at once granted it, and even accompanied her some distance, in order to show her the way out of the wood. When the king's daughters were once reunited, they were naturally very happy, and there were a great many questions asked about matters old and new. And marriage was also discussed. The oldest princess said, "It was silly of me to wish for a husband with golden hair and golden beard, for mine is worse than the veriest troll, and I have not known a happy day since we married." And the second went on, "Yes, and I am no better off, for although I have a husband with silver hair and a silver beard, he dislikes me so heartily that he begrudges me a single hour of happiness." Then her sisters turned to the youngest princess and asked how she fared. "Well," was her answer, "I really cannot complain, for though I only got a lame dog, he is such a dear good fellow and so kind to me that it would be hard to find a better husband." The other princesses were much surprised to hear this, and did not stop prying and questioning, and their sister answered all their questions faithfully. When they heard how splendidly she lived in the great castle, they grew jealous because she was so much better off than they were, and they insisted on knowing whether there was not some one little thing of which she could complain. "No," said the king's daughter, "I can only praise my husband for his kindness and amiability, and there is but one thing lacking to make me perfectly happy." "What is it? What is it?" cried both sisters with a single voice. "Every night when he comes home," said the princess, "he turns into a human being, and I am sorry that I can never see what he really looks like." Then both sisters again with one voice began to scold the dog loudly, because he had a secret which he kept from his wife. And since her sisters now continually spoke about it, her own curiosity awoke once more. She forgot her husband's command, and asked how she might manage to see him without his knowing it. "Oh," said the oldest princess, "nothing easier. Here is a little lamp, which you must hide carefully. Then you need only get up at night when he is asleep, and light the lamp in order to see him in his true shape." This advice seemed good to the king's daughter. She took the lamp, hid it in her breast, and promised to do all that her sisters had counselled. When the time came for them to part, the youngest princess went back to her beautiful castle. The day passed like every other day. When evening came at last and the dog had gone to bed, the princess was so driven by curiosity that she could hardly wait until he had fallen asleep. Then she rose, softly lit her lamp, and drew near the bed to look at him while he slept. But no one can describe her astonishment when, throwing the light on the bed, she saw no lame dog lying there, but the handsomest youth her eyes had ever beheld. She could not stop looking at him, but sat up all night bending over his pillow, and the more she looked at him, the handsomer he seemed to grow, until she forgot everything else in the world. At last the morning came, and as the first star began to pale in the dawn, the youth began to grow restless and awaken. The princess, much frightened, blew out her lamp and lay down in her bed. The youth thought she was sleeping and did not wish to wake her, so he rose quietly, assumed his other shape, went away, and did not appear again all day long. And when evening came and it grew late, everything happened as before. The dog came home from the forest, and was very tired. But no sooner had he fallen asleep than the princess rose carefully, lit her lamp, and came over to look at him. And when she cast the light on his bed, it seemed to her as though the youth had grown even handsomer than the day before, and the longer she looked, the more handsome he became, until she had to laugh and weep from sheer love and longing. She could not take her eyes from him, and sat all night long bent over his pillow, forgetful of her promise and all else, only to be able to look at him. With the first ray of dawn the youth began to stir and awake. Then the princess was again frightened, quickly blew out her lamp, and lay down in her bed. The youth thought she was sleeping, and not wishing to waken her, rose softly, assumed his other shape, went away, and was gone for the entire day. At length it grew late again. Evening came, and the dog returned home from the forest as usual. But again the princess could not control her curiosity. No sooner was her husband sleeping than she rose quietly, lit her lamp, and drew near carefully in order to look at him while he slept. And when the light fell on the youth, he appeared to be handsomer than ever before. And the longer she looked, the more handsome he grew, until her heart burned in her breast, and she forgot all else in the world looking at him. She could not take her eyes from him, and sat up all night bending over his pillow. And when morning came and the sun rose, the youth began to move and awaken. Then the princess was much frightened, because she had paid no heed to the passing of time, and she tried to put out her lamp quickly. But her hand trembled, and a warm drop of oil fell on the youth, and he awoke. When he saw what she had done, he leaped up, terrified, instantly turned into a lame dog, and limped out into the forest. But the princess felt so remorseful that she nearly lost her senses, and she ran after him, wringing her hands and weeping bitterly, and begging him to return. But he did not come back. The king's daughter now wandered over hill and dale, along many a road new to her, in order to find her husband, and her tears flowed the while till it would have moved a stone. But the dog was gone, and stayed gone, though she looked for him north and south. When she saw that she could not find him, she thought she would return to her handsome castle. But there she was, just as unfortunate. The castle was nowhere to be seen, and wherever she went, she was surrounded by a forest black as coal. Then she came to the conclusion that the whole world had abandoned her, sat down on a stone, wept bitterly, and thought how much rather she would die than live without her husband. At that, a little toad hopped out from under the stone and said, "Lovely maiden, why do you sit here and weep?" And the princess answered, "It is my hard fate to weep and never be happy again. First of all, I have lost the love of my heart, and now I can no longer find my way back to the castle. So I must perish of hunger here, or else be devoured by wild beasts." "Oh," said the toad, "if that is all that troubles you, I can help you. If you will promise to be my dearest friend, I will show you the way." But that the princess did not want to do. She replied, "Ask of me what you will, save that alone. I have never loved anyone more than my lame dog, and so long as I live will never love anyone else better." With that she rose, wept bitterly, and continued her way. But the toad looked after her in a friendly manner, laughed to himself, and once more crept under his stone. After the king's daughter had wandered on for a long, long way, and still saw nothing but forest and wilderness, she grew very tired. She once more sat down on a stone, rested her chin on her hand, and prayed for death, since it was no longer possible for her to live with her husband. Suddenly there was a rustling in the bushes, and she saw a big grey wolf coming directly toward her. She was much frightened, since her one thought was that the wolf intended to devour her. But the wolf stopped, wagged his tail, and said, "Proud maiden, why do you sit here and weep so bitterly?" the princess answered. "It is my hard fate to weep and never be happy again. First of all, I have lost my heart's dearest, and now I cannot find my way back to the castle, and must perish of hunger or be devoured by wild beasts." "Oh," said the wolf, "if that is all that troubles you, I can help you. Let me be your best friend, and I will show you the way." But that did not suit the princess, and she replied, "Ask of me what you will, save that alone. I have never loved anyone more than my lame dog, and so long as I live, I will never love anyone else better." With that she rose, weeping bitterly, and continued on her way. But the wolf looked after her in a friendly manner, laughed to himself, and ran off hastily. After the princess had once more wandered for a long time in the wilderness, she was again so wearied and exhausted that she could not go on. She sat down on a stone, wrung her hands, and wished for death, since she could no longer live with her husband. At that moment she heard a hollow roaring that made the earth tremble, and a monstrous big lion appeared and came directly toward her. Now she was much frightened, for what else could she think but that the lion would tear her to pieces? But the beast was so weighed down with heavy iron chains that he could scarcely drag himself along, and the chains clashed at either side when he moved. When the lion finally reached the princess, he stopped, wagged his tail, and asked, "Beautiful maiden, why do you sit here and weep so bitterly?" The princess answered, "It is my hard fate to weep and never be happy again. First of all, I have lost my heart's dearest, and now I cannot find my way to the castle, and must perish of hunger or be devoured by wild beasts." "Oh," said the lion, "if that is all that troubles you, I can help you. If you will loose my chains and make me your best friend, I will show you the way." But the princess was so terrified that she could not answer the lion, far less venture to draw near him. Then she heard a clear voice sounding from the forest. It was a little nightingale who sat among the branches and sang, "Maiden, maiden, loose his chains." Then she felt sorry for the lion, grew braver, went up to him, unloosed his chains, and said, "Your chains I can loose for you, but I can never be your best friend, for I have never loved anyone more than my lame dog, and will never love anyone else better." And then a wondrous thing took place. At the very moment the last chain fell from him, the lion turned into a handsome young prince, and when the princess looked at him more closely, it was none other than her heart's dearest, who before had been a dog. She sank to the ground, clasped his knees, and begged him not to leave her again. But the prince raised her with deep affection, took her in his arms, and said, "No, now we shall never more be parted, for I am released from my enchantment, and have proved your faith toward me in every way." Then there was joy indescribable, and the prince took his young wife home to the beautiful castle, and there he became king, and she was his queen. And if they have not died, they are living there to this very day. The Mount of the Golden Queen. Once upon a time, a lad who tended the cattle in the wood was eating his noontide meal in a clearing in the forest. As he was sitting there, he saw a rat run into a juniper bush. His curiosity led him to look for it, but as he bent over, down he went, head over heels, and fell asleep. And he dreamed that he was going to find the princess on the Mount of the Golden Queen, but that he did not know the way. The following day he once more pastured his cattle in the wood, when he came to the same clearing, and again ate his dinner there. And again he saw the rat, and went to look for it, and again when he bent down he went head over heels, and fell fast asleep. And again he dreamed of the princess on the Mount of the Golden Queen, and that in order to get her he would need 70 pounds of iron and a pair of iron shoes. He awoke, and it was all a dream, But by now he had made up his mind to find the Mount of the Golden Queen, and he went home with his herd. On the third day, when he led out his cattle, he could not reach the clearing of his happy dream too soon. Again the rat showed itself, and when he went to look for it, he fell asleep, as he had done each preceding day. And again he dreamed of the princess on the Mount of the Golden Queen, and that she came to him and laid a letter and a band of gold in his pocket. Then he awoke, and to his indescribable surprise, he found in his pocket both of the things of which he had dreamed, the letter and the band. Now he had no time to attend to the cattle any longer, but drove them straight home. Then he went into the stable, led out a horse, sold it, and bought 70 pounds of iron and a pair of iron shoes with the money. He made the thole pins out of the iron, put on his iron shoes, and set forth. For a time he travelled by land, but at last he came to the lake which he had to cross. He saw naught but water before and behind him, and rowing so long and steadily that he wore out one thole pin after another, he at length reached land and a green meadow where no trees grew. He walked all around the meadow, and at last found a mound of earth from which smoke was rising. When he looked more closely, out came a woman who was 9 yards long. He asked her to tell him the way to the Mount of the Golden Queen, but she replied, "That I do not know. Go ask my sister, who is 9 yards taller than I am, and who lives in an earth mound which you can find without any trouble." So he left her, and came to a mound of earth that looked just like the first, and from which smoke was also rising. A woman at once came out, who was tremendously tall, and of her he asked the way to the Mount of the Golden Queen. "That I do not know," said she. "Go ask my brother, who is 9 yards taller than I am, and who lives in a hill a little further away." So he came to the hill, from which smoke was also rising, and knocked. A man at once came out who was a veritable giant, for he was 27 yards in length, and of him he asked the way to the Mount of the Golden Queen. Then the giant took a whistle and whistled in every direction, to call together all the animals to be found on the earth. And all the animals came from the woods, foremost among them a bear. The giant asked him about the Mount of the Golden Queen, but he knew nothing of it. Again the giant blew his whistle in every direction to call together all the fishes to be found in the waters. They came at once, and he asked them about the Mount of the Golden Queen, but they knew nothing of it. Once more the giant blew his whistle in every direction, and called together all the birds of the air. They came, and he asked the eagle about the Mount of the Golden Queen, and whether he knew where it might be. The eagle said, "Yes." "Well then, take this lad there," said the giant, "but do not treat him unkindly." This the eagle promised, allowed the youth to seat himself on his back, and then off they were through the air, over fields and forests, hill and dale, and before long they were above the ocean, and could see nothing but sky and water. Then the eagle dipped the youth in the ocean up to his ankles and asked, "Are you afraid?" "No," said the youth. Then the eagle flew on a while, and again dipped the youth into the water up to his knees and said, "Are you afraid?" "Yes," answered the youth, "but the giant said you were not to treat me unkindly." "Are you really afraid?" asked the eagle once more. "Yes," answered the youth. Then the eagle said, "The fear you now feel is the very same fear I felt when the princess thrust the letter and the golden band into your pocket." And with that they had reached a large, high mountain, in one side of which was a great iron door. They knocked, and a serving-maid appeared to open the door and admit them. The youth remained and was well received, but the eagle said farewell and flew back to his native land. The youth asked for a drink, and he was at once handed a beaker containing a refreshing draught. When he had emptied it and returned the beaker, He let the golden band drop into it, and when the maid brought back the beaker to her mistress, who was the princess of the Mount of the Golden Queen, the latter looked into the beaker, and behold, there lay a golden band which she recognized as her own. So she asked, "Is there someone here?" And when the maid answered in the affirmative, the princess said, "Bid him come in." And as soon as the youth entered, she asked him if he chanced to have a letter. The youth drew out the letter he had received in so strange a manner, and gave it to the princess. And when she had read it, she cried, full of joy, "Now I am delivered." And at that very moment, the mountain turned into a most handsome castle, with all sorts of precious things, servants, and every sort of convenience, each for its own purpose. Whether the princess and the youth married the story does not say, yet we must take for granted that a wedding is the proper end for the fairy tale. Hopgiant. Once upon a time there were two neighbors, one of them rich and the other poor. They owned a great meadow in common, which they were supposed to mow together and then divide the hay. But the rich neighbor wanted the meadow for himself alone, and told the poor one that he would drive him out of house and home if he did not come to an agreement with him that whichever one of them mowed the largest stretch of the meadowland in a single day should receive the entire meadow. Now the rich neighbor got together as many mowers as ever he could, but the poor one could not hire a single man. At last he despaired altogether and wept, because he did not know how he could manage to get so much as a bit of hay for the cow. Then it was that a large man stepped up to him and said, "Do not grieve so. I can tell you what you ought to do. When the mowing begins, just call out, 'Old Hopgiant,' 3 times in succession, and you'll not be at a loss, as you shall see for yourself." And with that he disappeared. Then the poor man's heart grew less heavy, and he gave over worrying. So one fine day his rich neighbor came along with no fewer than 20 farmhands, and they mowed down one swath after another. But the poor neighbor did not even take the trouble to begin when he saw how the others took hold, and that he himself would not be able to do anything alone. Then the big man occurred to him, and he called out, "Old Hopgiant!" But no one came, and the mowers all laughed at him and mocked him, thinking he had gone out of his mind. Then he called again, "Old Hopgiant!" And, just as before, there was no Hopgiant to be seen, and the mowers could scarcely swing their scythes, for they were laughing fit to split. And then he cried for the 3rd time, "Old Hopgiant!" And there appeared a fellow of truly horrible size, with a scythe as large as a ship's mast. And now the merriment of the rich peasants' mowers came to an end, for when the giant began to mow and fling about his scythe, they were frightened at the strength he put into his work, and before they knew it, he had mown half the meadow. Then the rich neighbor fell into a rage, rushed up, and gave the giant a good kick. But that did not help him, for his foot stuck to the giant, while the latter no more felt the kick than if it had been a flea bite, and kept right on working. Then the rich neighbor thought of a scheme to get free, and gave the giant a kick with his other foot, but this foot also stuck fast, and there he hung like a tick. Old Hopgiant mowed the whole meadow, and then flew up into the air, and the rich man had to go along hanging to him like a hawser. And thus the poor neighbor was left sole master of the place. The Princes and the Glass Mountain. Once upon a time there was a king who took such a joy in the chase that he knew no greater pleasure than hunting wild beasts. Early and late he camped in the forest with hawk and hound, and good fortune always followed his hunting. But it chanced one day that he could rouse no game, although he had tried in every direction since morning. And then, When evening was coming on, and he was about to ride home, he saw a dwarf or wild man running through the forest before him. The king at once spurred on his horse, rode after the dwarf, seized him, and he was surprised at his strange appearance, for he was small and ugly like a troll, and his hair was as stiff as bean straw. But no matter what the king said to him, he would return no answer, nor say a single word one way or another. This angered the king, who was already out of sorts because of his ill success at the hunt, and he ordered his people to seize the wild man and guard him carefully lest he escape. Then the king rode home. Now his people said to him, "You should keep the wild man a captive here at your court, in order that the whole country may talk of what a mighty huntsman you are. Only you should guard him so that he does not escape, because he is of a sly and treacherous disposition." When the king had listened to them, he said nothing for a long time. Then he replied, "I will do as you say, and if the wild man escape, it shall be no fault of mine. But I vow that whoever lets him go shall die without mercy, and though he were my own son." The following morning, as soon as the king awoke, he remembered his vow. He at once sent for wood and beams, and had a small house or cage built quite close to the castle. The small house was built of great timbers, and protected by strong locks and bolts, so that none could break in, and a peephole was left in the middle of the wall through which food might be thrust. When everything was completed, the king had the wild man led up, placed in the small house, and he himself took and kept the key. There the dwarf had to sit a prisoner, day and night, and the people came afoot and a horseback to gaze at him. Yet no one ever heard him complain, or so much as utter a single word. Thus matters went for some time. Then a war broke out in the land, and the king had to take the field. At parting he said to the queen, "You must rule the kingdom now in my stead, and I leave land and people in your care. But there is one thing you must promise me you will do, that you will guard the wild man securely, so that he does not escape while I am away." The queen promised to do her best in all respects, and the king gave her the key to the cage. Thereupon he had his long galleys, his sea-wolves, push out from the shore, hoisted sail, and took his course far, far away to the other country. The king and queen had only one child, a prince who was still small, yet great in promise. Now when the king had gone, it chanced one day that the little fellow was wandering about the royal courtyard and came to the wild man's cage, and he began to play with an apple of gold he had. And while he was playing with it, it happened that suddenly the apple fell through the window in the wall of the cage. The wild man at once appeared and threw back the apple. This seemed a merry game to the little fellow. He threw the apple in again, and the wild man threw it out again, and thus they played for a long time. Yet for all the game had been so pleasant, it turned to sorrow in the end, for the wild man kept the apple of gold and would not give it back again. And when all was of no avail, neither threats nor prayers, the little fellow at last began to weep. Then the wild man said, "Your father did ill to capture me, and you will never get your apple of gold again unless you let me out." The little fellow answered, "And how can I let you out? Just you give me back my apple again, my apple of gold." Then the wild man said, "You must do what I now tell you. Go up to your mother, the queen, and beg her to comb your hair. Then see to it that you take the key from her girdle and come down and unlock the door. After that, you can return the key in the same way, without anyone knowing anything about it." After the wild man had talked to the boy in this way, he finally did as he said, went up to his mother, begged her to comb his hair, and took the key from her girdle. Then he ran down to the cage and opened the door. And when they parted, the dwarf said, "Here is your apple of gold that I promised to give back to you, and I thank you for setting me free. And another time, when you have need of me, I will help you in turn." And with that he ran off on his own way. But the prince went back to his mother and returned the key in the same way he had taken it. When they learned at the king's court that the wild man had broken out, there was great commotion, and the queen sent people over hill and dale to look for him. But he was gone, and he stayed gone. Thus matters went for a while, and the queen grew more and more unhappy, for she expected her husband to return every day. And when he did reach shore, his first question was whether the wild man had been well guarded. Then the queen had to confess how matters stood, and told him how everything had happened. But the king was enraged beyond measure, and said he would punish the malefactor, no matter who he might be. And he ordered a great investigation at his court, and every human being in it had to testify. But no one knew anything. At last the little prince also had to come forward, and as he stood before the king he said, "I know that I have deserved my father's anger. Yet I cannot hide the truth, for I let out the wild man." Then the queen turned white, and the others as well, for there was not one who was not fond of the prince. At last the king spoke. "Never shall it be said of me that I was false to my vow, even for the sake of my own flesh and blood. No, you must die the death you have deserved." And with that he gave the order to take the prince to the forest and kill him. And they were to bring back the boy's heart as a sign that his command had been obeyed. Now, sorrow unheard of reigned among the people, and all pleaded for the little prince. But the king's word could not be recalled. His serving men did not dare disobey, took the boy in their midst, and set forth. And when they had gone a long way into the forest, they saw a swineherd tending his pigs. Then one said to another, "It does not seem right to me to lay hand on the king's son. Let us buy a pig instead and take its heart. Then all will believe it is the heart of the prince." The other serving men thought that he spoke wisely, so they bought a pig from the swineherd, led it into the wood, butchered it, and took its heart. Then they told the prince to go his way and never return. They themselves went back to the king's castle, and it is easy to imagine what grief they caused when they told of the prince's death. The king's son did what the serving men had told him. He kept on wandering as far as he could, and never had any other food than the nuts and wild berries that grow in the forest. And when he had wandered far and long, he came to a mountain upon whose very top stood a fir tree. Said he to himself, "After all, I might as well climb the fir tree and see whether I can find a path anywhere." No sooner said than done. He climbed the tree, and as he sat in the very top of its crown and looked about on every side, he saw a large and splendid royal castle rising in the distance and gleaming in the sun. Then he grew very happy, and at once set forth in that direction. On the way he met a farmhand who was ploughing, and begged him to change clothes with him, which he did. Thus fitted out, he at last reached the king's castle, went in, asked for a place, and was taken on as a herdsman to tend the king's cattle. Now he went to the forest early and late, and in the course of time forgot his grief, grew up, and became so tall and brave that his equal could not be found. And now our story turns to the king who was reigning at the splendid castle. He had been married, and he had an only daughter. She was lovelier by far than other maidens, and had so kind and cheerful a disposition that whoever could some day take her to his home might well consider himself fortunate. Now, when the princess had completed her 15th year, a quite unheard-of swarm of suitors made their appearance, as may well be imagined, and for all that she said no to all of them, they only increased in number. At last the princess said, "None other shall win me save he who can ride up the high glass mountain in full armor." The king thought this a good suggestion. He approved of his daughter's wish, and had proclaimed throughout the kingdom that none other should have the princess save he who could ride up the glass mountain. And when the day set by the king had arrived, the princess was led up the glass mountain. There she sat on its highest peak, with a golden crown on her head and a golden apple in her hand, and she looked so immeasurably lovely that there was no one who would not have liked to risk his life for her. Just below the foot of the hill, all the suitors assembled with splendid horses and glittering armor that shone like fire in the sun, and from round about the people flocked together in great crowds to watch their tilting. And when everything was ready, the signal was given by horns and trumpets, and then the suitors, one after another, raced up the mountain with all their might. But the mountain was high, as slippery as ice, and besides it was steep beyond all measure. Not one of the suitors rode up more than a little way before he tumbled down again, head over heels, and it might well happen that arms and legs were broken in the process. This made so great a noise, together with the neighing of the horses, the shouting of the people, and the clash of arms, that the tumult and the shouting could be heard far away. And while all this was going on, the king's son was rambling about with his oxen, deep in the wood. But when he heard the tumult and the clashing of arms, he sat down on a stone, leaned his cheek on his hand, and became lost in thought, for it had occurred to him how gladly he would have fared forth with the rest. Suddenly he heard footsteps, and when he looked up, the wild man was standing before him. "Thank you for the last time," said he, "and why do you sit here so lonely and full of sorrow?" "Well," said the prince, "I have no choice but to be sad and joyless. Because of you, I am a fugitive from the land of my father, and now I have not even a horse and armor to ride up the glass mountain and fight for the princess." "Ah," said the wild man, "if that be all you want, then I can help you. You helped me once before, and now I will help you in turn." Then he took the prince by the hand, led him deep down into the earth into his cave, and behold, there hung a suit of armor forged out of the hardest steel, and so bright that a blue gleam played all around it. Right beside it stood a splendid steed, saddled and bridled, pawing the earth with his steel hoofs, and champing his bit till the white foam dropped to the ground. The wild man said, "Now get quickly into your armor, ride out and try your luck. In the meantime I will tend your oxen." The prince did not wait to be told a second time, but put on helmet and armor, buckled on his spurs, hung his sword at his side, and felt as light in his steel armor as a bird in the air. Then he leaped into the saddle, so that every clasp and buckle rang, laid his reins on the neck of his steed, and rode hastily toward the mountain. The princess's suitors were about to give up the contest, for none of them had won the prize, though each had done his best. And while they stood there thinking it over, and saying that perhaps fortune would favor them another time, they suddenly saw a youth ride out of the wood straight toward the mountain. He was clad in steel from head to foot, with helmet on head, sword in belt and shield on arm, and he sat his horse with such knightly grace that it was a pleasure to look at him. At once all eyes were turned to the strange knight, and all asked who he might be, for none had ever seen him before. Yet they had had but little time to talk and question, for no sooner had he cleared the wood than he rose in his stirrups, gave his horse the spurs, and shot forward like an arrow straight up the glass mountain. Yet he did not ride up all the way, but when he had reached the middle of the steep ascent, he suddenly flung around his steed and rode down again, so that the sparks flew from his horse's hoofs. Then he disappeared in the wood like a bird in flight. One may imagine the excitement which now seized upon all the people, and there was not one who did not admire the strange knight. All agreed they had never seen a braver knight. Time passed, and the princess's suitors decided to try their luck a second time. The king's daughter was once more led up the glass mountain with great pomp and richly gowned, and was seated on its topmost peak with the golden crown on her head and a golden apple in her hand. At the foot of the hill gathered all the suitors with handsome horses and splendid armour, and round about stood all the people to watch the contest. When all was ready, the signal was given by horns and trumpets, and at the same moment the suitors, one after another, darted up the mountain with all their might. But all took place as at the first time. The mountain was high and as slippery as ice, and besides it was steep beyond all measure. Not one rode up more than a little way before tumbling down again head over heels. Meanwhile there was much noise, and the horses neighed, and the people shouted, and the armour clashed, so that the tumult and the shouting sounded far into the deep wood. And while all this was going on, the young prince was tending his oxen, which was his duty. But when he heard the tumult and the clashing of arms, he sat down on a stone, leaned his cheek on his hand, and wept, for he thought of the king's beautiful daughter, and it occurred to him how much he would like to take part and ride with the rest. At very moment he heard footsteps, and when he looked up, the wild man was standing before him. "Good day," said the wild man, "and why do you sit here so lonely and full of sorrow?" Thereupon the prince replied, "I have no choice but to be sad and joyless, because of you. I am a fugitive from the land of my father, and now I have not even a horse and armour to ride up the mountain and fight for the princess." "Ah," said the wild man, "if that be all you want, then I can help you. You helped me once before, and now I will help you in turn." Then he took the prince by the hand, led him deep down in the earth into his cave, and there on the wall hung a suit of armour altogether forged of the clearest silver, and so bright that it shone afar. Right beside it stood a snow-white steed, saddled and bridled, pawing the earth with his silver hoofs, and champing his bit till the foam dropped to the ground. The wild man said, "Now get quickly into your armour, ride out and try your luck. In the meantime, I will tend your oxen." The prince did not wait to be told a second time, but put on his helmet and armour in all haste, securely buckled on his spurs, hung his sword at his side, and felt as light in his silver armour as a bird in the air. Then he leaped into the saddle so that every clasp and buckle rang, laid his reins on the neck of his steed, and rode hastily toward the glass mountain. The princess's suitors were about to give over the contest, for none of them had won the prize, though each had played a man's part. And while they stood there thinking it over, and saying that perhaps fortune would favour them the next time, they suddenly saw a youth ride out of the wood, straight toward the mountain. He was clad in silver from head to foot, with helmet on head, shield on arm, and sword at side, and he sat his horse with such knightly grace that a braver-looking youth had probably never been seen. At once all eyes were turned toward him, and the people noticed that he was the same knight who had appeared before. But the prince did not leave them much time for wonderment, for no sooner had he reached the plain than he rose in his stirrups, spurred on his horse, and rode like fire straight up the steep mountain. Yet he did not ride quite up to the top, but when he had come to its crest, he greeted the princess with great courtesy, flung about his steed, and rode down the mountain again till the sparks flew about his horse's hoofs. Then he disappeared into the wood as the storm flies. As one may imagine, The people's excitement was even greater than the first time, and there was not one who did not admire the strange knight. And all were agreed that a more splendid steed or a handsomer youth were nowhere to be found. Time passed, and the king set a day when his daughter's suitors were to make a third trial. The princess was now once more led to the glass mountain and seated herself on its highest peak, with the golden crown and the golden apple as she had before. At the foot of the mountain gathered the whole swarm of suitors, with splendid horses and polished armour, handsome beyond anything seen thus far, and round about the people flocked together to watch the contest. When all was ready, the suitors, one after another, darted up the mountain with all their might. The mountain was as smooth as ice, and besides, it was steep beyond all measure, so that not one rode up more than a little way before tumbling down again head over heels. This made a great noise. The horses neighed, the people shouted, and the armour clashed, till the tumult and the shouting echoed far into the wood. While this was all taking place, the king's son was busy tending his oxen as usual, and when he once more heard the noise and the clash of arms, he sat down on a stone, leaned his cheek on his hand, and wept bitterly. Then he thought of the lovely princess, and would gladly have ventured his life to win her. That very moment the wild man was standing before him. "Good day," said the wild man, "and why do you sit here so lonely and full of sorrow?" "I have no choice but to be sad and joyless," said the prince. "Because of you, I am a fugitive from the land of my father, and now I have not even a sword and armour to ride up the mountain and fight for the princess." "Ah," said the wild man, "if that be all that troubles you, I can help you. You helped me once before, and now I will help you in turn." With that he took the prince by the hand, led him into his cave deep down under the earth, and showed him a suit of armour, all forged of the purest gold, and gleaming so brightly that its golden glow shone far and wide. Beside it stood a magnificent steed, saddled and bridled, pawing the earth with its golden hoofs, and champing its bit until the foam fell to the ground. The wild man said, "Now get quickly into your armour, ride out and try your luck. In the meantime I will tend your oxen." And to tell the truth, the prince was not lazy, but put on his helmet and armour, buckled on his golden spurs, hung his sword at his side, and felt as light in his golden armour as a bird in the air. Then he leaped into the saddle, so that every clasp and buckle rang, laid his reins on the neck of his steed, and rode hastily toward the mountain. The princess's suitors were about to give up the contest, for none of them had won the prize, though each had done his best. And while they stood there thinking over what was to be done, they suddenly saw a youth come riding out of the wood straight toward the mountain. He was clad in gold from head to foot, with the golden helmet on his head, the golden shield on his arm, and the golden sword at his side. And so knightly was his bearing that a bolder warrior could not have been met with in all the wide world. At once all eyes were turned toward him, and one could see that he was the same youth who had already appeared at different times. But the prince gave them but little time to question and wonder, for no sooner had he reached the plain than he gave his horse the spurs, and shot up the steep mountain like a flash of lightning. When he had reached its highest peak, he greeted the beautiful princess with great courtesy, kneeled before her, and received the golden apple from her hand. Then he flung about his steed, and rode down the glass mountain again, so that the sparks flew about the golden hoofs of his horse, and a long ribbon of golden light gleamed behind him. At last he disappeared in the wood like a star. What a commotion now reigned about the mountain! The people broke forth into cheers that could be heard far away. Horns sounded, trumpets called, horses neighed, arms clashed, and the king had proclaimed far and near that the unknown golden knight had won the prize. Now all that was wanting was some information about the golden knight, for no one knew him, and all the people expected that he would at once make his appearance at the castle. But he did not come. This caused great surprise, and the princess grew pale and ill. But the king was put out, and the suitors murmured and found fault day by day. And at length, when they were all at their wits' end, the king had a great meeting announced at his castle, which every man, high and low, was to attend, so that the princess might choose among them herself. There was no one who was not glad to go for the princess's sake, and also because it was a royal command, and a countless number of people gathered together. And when they had all assembled, the princess came out of the castle with great pomp, and followed by her maids, passed through the entire multitude. But no matter how much she looked about her on every side, she did not find the one for whom she was looking. When she reached the last row, she saw a man who stood quite hidden by the crowd. He had a flat cap and a wide grey mantle, such as shepherds wear, but its hood was drawn up so that his face could not be seen. At once the princess ran up to him, drew down his hood, fell upon his neck and cried, "Here he is! Here he is!" Then all the people laughed, for they saw that it was the king's herdsman, and the king himself called out, "May God console me for the son-in-law who is to be my portion." The man, however, was not at all abashed, but replied, "Oh, you need not worry about that at all. I am just as much a king's son as you are a king." With that he flung aside his wide mantle, and there were none left to laugh, for instead of the grey herdsman there stood a handsome prince, clad in gold from head to foot, and holding the princess's golden apple in his hand, and all could see that it was the same youth who had ridden up the glass mountain. Then they prepared a feast whose like had never before been seen, and the prince received the king's daughter, and with her half of the kingdom. Thenceforward they lived happily in their kingdom, and if they have not died, they are living there still. But nothing more was ever heard of the wild man, and that is the end. Queen. Once upon a time there was a poor, poor boy. He went to the king and begged to be taken into service as a shepherd, and all called him Sheep Peter. While he was herding his sheep, he used to amuse himself with his crossbow. One day he saw a crane sitting in an oak tree, and wanted to shoot her. The crane, however, hopped down further and further, and at last settled in the lowest branches. Then she said, "If you promise not to shoot me, I will help you whenever you are in trouble. You need only to call out, 'God aid me,' and 'Queen Crane, stay by me,' and I will succeed." With that, the bird flew away. At length, war broke out, and the king had to take the field. Then Sheep Peter came to the king and asked whether he might not be allowed to go along to war. They gave him an old nag to ride, and he rode into a swamp along the highway, and there the horse died. So he sat down and clicked with his tongue, but the horse would not move, and the people who rode by had their sport with him, while the youth pretended to feel sad. When the people had all passed by, the youth went to the oak in which the Queen Crane dwelt. Here he was given a black steed, a suit of brazen armour, and a silver sword. Thus he rode to battle, and got there as quickly as he could wish. Then he said, "God aid me, and Queen Crane stay by me, and I will succeed." With that he killed all the enemy and rode away again. But the king thought that an angel had come to help him, and wanted to hold him back. The youth, however, rode quickly back to the oak, took off his armour, went down to the swamp, and once more began to click to his horse. When the people rode by, they laughed and said, "You were not along today, so you missed seeing how an angel came and killed all the enemy." And the youth pretended to feel sad, so sad. The following day, the king once more had to take the field, and sheep. Peter came to him and said he wanted to go along. So they gave him an old nag to ride, and he rode into a swamp beside the highway. Then he sat down and clicked with his tongue, but the horse would not move. When the people rode by, they had their sport with him. But the youth pretended to feel sad, so sad. When the people had gone by, he went to the oak in which the Queen Crane dwelt, and was given a white steed, a suit of silver armor, and a golden sword. Thus equipped, he rode to battle. When he arrived, he said, "God aid me, and Queen Crane, and I will succeed." But he had forgotten to say, "Stay by me," and so he was shot in the leg. But the king took out his handkerchief and tied up his leg. Then the youth said once more, "God aid me, and Queen Crane, stay by me, and I will succeed." And he slew all of the enemy. Then the king thought he was an angel from heaven and wanted to hold him. But the youth rode quickly to the oak, took off his armor, and then went down to his nag in the swamp and tried to get it to move while the soldiers were passing. They laughed and said, "You are not along today," and did not see how an angel came from heaven and killed all of the enemy. The youth pretended to be very sad. On the third day, all happened as before. The king took the field. The youth was given a wretched nag and rode it into a swamp beside the highway. Then he began to click with his tongue, but the nag would not go on, and the people who rode past laughed at him. He pretended to feel very sad, but when the people had passed, he went to the oak in which Queen Crane dwelt, and she gave him a red steed, a golden sword, and a golden suit of armor. Thus equipped, he rode to war, and all happened as before. He said, "God aid me, and Queen Crane stay by me, and I will succeed," and slew all the enemy. The king thought he was an angel from heaven, and wanted to hold him back by all means. But the youth rode quickly to the oak, took off his armor, and rode down to the swamp where he had his 3 nags. He hid the king's handkerchief, and when the people passed by, he was clicking with his tongue as usual. Now, the king had 3 princesses, and they were to be carried off by 3 mere women. So the king had it proclaimed that whoever could rescue them should receive one of them for a wife. When the day came on which the oldest princess was to be carried away, Peter received a steed, a suit of armor, and a sword from Queen Crane. With them he rode to the castle, fetched the princess, took her before him on his steed, and then lay down on the seashore to sleep. He had a dog with him as well, and while he slept, the princess wove her hair ribbon into his hair. Suddenly the mere woman appeared, and she awakened him and bade him mount his steed. Many people had been standing there, but when the mere woman appeared, they all took fright and climbed into tall trees. But the youth said, "God aid me, and Queen Crane stay by me, and I will succeed." And then he slew the mere woman. Thereupon he rode quickly back to Queen Crane, took off his armor, and herded his sheep again. But among the onlookers had been a nobleman who threatened the princess and forced her to say that he had rescued her, and from sheep. No one heard a word. On the following day the second princess was to be carried off. So Peter went to Queen Crane, who gave him a steed, a suit of armor, and a sword, and with them he rode to the castle and fetched the second princess. When they reached the seashore, the mere woman had not yet appeared. So the youth lay down to sleep and said to the princess, "Wake me when the mere woman comes, and if you cannot wake me, then tell my horse." With that he fell asleep, and meanwhile the princess wove a string of pearls into his hair. When the mere woman came, The princess tried to wake him, but he would not wake up at all, and so she told the horse to waken him. And the horse did wake him. The great lords, however, who were standing about, climbed into the trees out of pure fright when the mere woman appeared. The youth took the princess on his steed, cried, "God aid me!" and "Queen Crane, stay by me, and I will succeed." And with that he slew the mere woman. Then he rode quickly back to Queen Crane, took off his armour, and led his flock out to pasture. But among the onlookers had been a count who threatened the princess, and said he would thrust her through with his sword if she did not swear he had rescued her. The princess did so out of fear, but from Sheep Peter no one heard a word. On the third day the same thing happened. Sheep Peter was given a suit of armour, a sword, and a steed by Queen Crane, and fetched the youngest princess. When he lay down on the seashore to sleep, he said to her, "When the mere woman comes, wake me, and if you cannot wake me, then tell the horse to wake me, and if the horse cannot wake me, then ask the dog to wake me." When the mere woman came, neither the princess nor the horse was able to wake him, and they had to call the dog to help them. At last he woke up, took the princess on his horse, cried, "God aid me, and Queen Crane, stay by me, and I will succeed," and slew the mere woman. Then he rode back again to Queen Crane, took off his armour, and let his flock out to pasture. Not long after, the deliverers of the princesses were to come to the castle and be married. But first the king asked his daughters which of the three each wanted to have. So the oldest said, "The gentleman from court," and the second said, "The count," but the third said, "Sheep Peter." Then the king was very angry with his youngest daughter, for he did not believe for a moment that Sheep Peter had delivered her. But she insisted and said she would take no one else. The king then presented an apple of pure gold to the count and the court gentleman, but Sheep Peter got nothing. Now all three of them were to hold a 3 days shooting match, in order to see which was the best shot, for the king hoped that Sheep Peter would make a proper laughing-stock of himself, and drop far behind the others without any effort on their part. But Sheep Peter was so good a marksman that he hit everything at which he aimed, and the very first day he shot a great deal, while the others shot but little. Then they bought the game he had shot from him, and gave him a golden apple for it. The same thing happened the second day, and thus he got the other gold apple. But when Peter came home on the evening of the first and second day, he had only a crow dangling from his blunderbuss. And when he met the king, he threw the crow to the ground and cried, "There is my whole bag." On the third day all went as before. Sheep Peter hit everything at which he aimed, but the others scored no hits. Then Sheep Peter promised them all he had bagged if they would let him write what he chose on their necks. They agreed to the bargain, and he wrote on the neck of each, "A thief and a rascal." Then all three went home, and again Peter had no more than a crow to show. At night all three of them slept together in one room. When they woke in the morning, the king came in to them, said good morning, and asked how they were. But he was much surprised to see that Sheep Peter was keeping them company. Then the youth said, "I was in the war, and slew all of the enemy." "Ah," said the king, "you did not do that. It was an angel from heaven, for you were sitting in the swamp." Then Sheep Peter drew out the king's handkerchief, and then the king recognized him. Then the herdsman said, "I also delivered the princesses." But the king would not believe that, and laughed at him. And then the youngest princess came along and told how it all had happened. And the youth took out the ribands of the other princesses, and the king had to believe that this too was true. Then Peter continued, "I also shot all the game." And again the king would not believe him and said, "Nonsense! Why, you never brought home anything of an evening but a wretched crow." Then Peter produced the golden apples. "I was given this one for the first day, and the other for the second." "And what did you get for the third?" asked the king. Then the shepherd showed him what he had written on the necks of the other suitors, and when the king saw that, he had to believe him. And so he really got the youngest princess, and with her half of the kingdom, and after the king's death, all of it. But the two sham heroes got nothing at all, and had only their trouble for their pains. Tales of the Trolls. A peasant from Djursagard, in the parish of Hanger, had gone to the forest the day before Christmas, and started out for home late in the evening. He had just about reached the Klinterberg when he heard someone call out, "Tell the malt swine to come home, for her child has fallen into the fire." When the peasant reached home, there stood his wife, who had been brewing the Yuletide ale, and she was complaining that though she brewed and brewed, it did not have the right flavour. Then he told her what had been shouted at him from the hill, and that very moment a troll witch, whom they had not noticed before, darted down from the stove and made off in a great hurry. And when they looked closer, they found that she had left behind a great kettle full of the best malt which she had gathered during the brewing, and that was the reason the poor woman had not been able to give her brew the right flavour. The kettle was large, made of ornamented metal, and was long preserved in Hanger. It was at length sold at auction in 1838, and melted down. In former days, when a child came into the world, his mother was known as a heathen, until she could take him to church to be christened, and it was not safe for her to leave the house unless she carried steel about her in some shape or form. Now once there was one of these heathen women in Norra Rid, in the parish of Hanger, who prepared lunch for the mowers and went out and called them in to eat. Then one of the mowers said to her, "I cannot come, for my sheaf is not yet bound." "I will bind it for you," said the woman. The mowers went in and ate, but saw no more of her. They went back into the field, and were about to take up their work again, but still neither saw nor heard her. They began to search and hunted for a number of days, but all in vain. Time passed till it was late in the fall. One day the weather was clear and sunny. To this very day there is a cotter's hut called Kusabo that stands on a hill named Kusas, and the cotter who lived there went to look for a horse. And there on the hillside he saw the woman sitting who had disappeared, and she was sewing. It was not far from Kusabo to Norarid, so he recognized her at once. He said, "Oh, you poor thing, and here you sit." "Yes," said she, "but you must never mention it to Lars. That was her husband, for I shall never return from this place. Even now I am only allowed to sit outside for a little while. Once upon a time, a girl was hunting for berries on Kusabo Mountain, and was taken into the hill. But she wept night and day, which disgruntled the trolls, and they let her out again. But just as they were letting her out, one of the trolls hit her such a blow on the back that she was humpbacked for the rest of her life. She herself used to tell how she had been kept in the hill. Sharko N Inns the Troll. Woman. In the old days there lived on a headland that juts out into the northwestern corner of Lake Rasval, in the neighbourhood of the Linde mining district, a charcoal burner named Nils, generally known as Charcoal Nils. He let a farmhand attend to his little plot of land, and he himself made his home in the forest, where he chopped wood in the summer and burned it to charcoal in the winter. Yet no matter how hard he struggled, his work was unblessed with reward, and no one ever spoke of him save as poor Charcoal Nils. One day, When he was on the opposite shore of the lake, near the gloomy Hofberg, a strange woman came up to him and asked whether he needed someone to help him with his charcoal burning. "Yes, indeed," said he. "Help would be welcome." So she began to gather blocks of wood and tree trunks, more than charcoal Nils could have dragged together with his horse, and by noon there was enough wood for a new kiln. When evening came, she asked the charcoal burner whether he was satisfied with the day's work she had done, and if she were to come back the next day. That suited the charcoal burner perfectly, and she came back the next day and all the following ones. And when the kiln had been burned out, she helped Nils clear it, and never before had he had such a quantity of charcoal, nor charcoal of so fine a quality. So she became his wife, and lived with him in the wood for 3 years. They had 3 children, yet this worried Nils but little, seeing that she looked after them, and they gave him no trouble. But when the 4th year came, she grew more exacting, and insisted on going back to his home with him and living with him there. Nils wished to hear nothing about this, yet since she was so useful to him in his charcoal burning, he did not betray his feelings, and said he would think it over. It happened one Sunday that he went to church where he had not been for many years, and what he heard there brought up thoughts he had not known since the innocent days of his childhood. He began to wonder whether there were not some hocus-pocus about the charcoal burning, and whether it were not due to the forest woman who aided him so willingly. Preoccupied with this and other thoughts, he forgot, while returning to his kiln, that he had promised the strange woman at the very beginning, when she had first helped him, that, whenever he had been home and was returning to the kiln, he would rap 3 times with his axe against an old pine tree not far from it. On this occasion, as we have said, he forgot the sign, and as a result he saw something that nearly robbed him of his wits. As he drew near the kiln, he saw it all aflame, and around it stood the 3 children and their mother, and they were clearing out the kiln. They were pulling down and putting out so that flames, smoke and ashes whirled sky high, but instead of the spruce branches that were generally used to put out the fire, they had bushy tails which they dipped in the snow. When Charcoal Nils had looked on for a while, he slunk back to the old pine tree and made its trunk echo to the sound of his 3 axe strokes till one could hear them on the Hofberg. Then he went to the kiln, as though he had seen nothing, and all went on as before. The kiln was glowing with a handsome, even glow, and the tall woman was about and working as usual. As soon as she saw Charcoal Nils, she came back with her pressing demand that he take her home to his little house, and that they live there. "Yes, that shall come about," said Nils to console her, and turned back home to fetch a horse. But instead he went out on the headline of Kalanaes, on the eastern shore of Lake Rasval, where a wise man lived, and asked the latter what he should do. The old man advised him to go home and hitch his horse to his charcoal wagon, but to hitch the horse in such wise that there would be not a single loop either in the harness or traces. Then he was to mount the horse and ride back to the kiln without stopping, have the troll woman and her children get into the wagon, and at once drive out on the ice with them. The charcoal burner did as the old man told him, saddled his horse, paying strict attention that there were no loops in saddle or bridle, rode across the ice through the wood to his kiln, and told the troll woman and her children to get in. Then he quickly turned back through the wood, out on the ice, and there let his horse run as fast as he could. When he reached the middle of the lake, he saw a pack of wolves running along in the direction of a border land at the northern end of the lake and heading for the ice. Then he tore the saddle harness from the traces, so that the wagon with the troll folk was left standing on the bare ice, and rode as fast as his horse could carry him for the opposite shore. When the trolls saw the wolves, they began to scream. "Turn back! Turn back!" cried the mother, And if you will not for my sake, then at least do so for the sake of Vibba, Pee-wee, your youngest daughter." But Charcoal Nils rode for the shore without looking back. Then he heard the troll-woman calling on others for aid. "Brother in the Harsberg, sister in Streeper, cousin in Ringfels, take the loop and pull. There is no loop to pull," came the answer from deep within the Harsberg. "Then catch him at Harkelan. He is not riding in that direction." The reply came from Ringfels, and indeed Charcoal Nils did not ride in that direction, but over stick and stone straight to his own home. Yet when he reached his own courtyard, the horse fell, and a shot from the trolls tore away a corner of the stable. Nils shortly after fell sick, and had to lie abed for a number of weeks. When he was well again, he sold his forest land and worked the little farm by the cottage until his death. So that was one occasion when the troll folk came off second best. The Three Dogs. Once upon a time there was a king who went forth into the world and fetched back a beautiful queen. And after they had been married a while, God gave them a little daughter. Then there was great rejoicing in the city and throughout the country, for the people wished their king all that was good, since he was kind and just. While the child lay in its cradle, a strange-looking old woman entered the room, and no one knew who she was, nor whence she came. The old woman spoke a verse over the child, and said that she must not be allowed out under the open sky until she were full 15 years of age, since otherwise the mountain troll would fetch her. When the king heard this, he took her words to heart and posted guards to watch over the little princess so that she would not get out under the open sky. Some time afterward, God gave the royal pair another little daughter, and again the whole kingdom rejoiced. But the wise old woman once more put in an appearance, and warned the king not to let the princess out under the open sky until she were full 15 years of age. And then, after a time, God gave the royal pair a third daughter. This time, too, the old woman appeared, and repeated what she had already twice said. Then the king was much grieved, for he loved his children above everything in the world. Therefore he gave strict orders that the 3 princesses were always to be kept beneath the roof of the castle, and that none were to dare transgress against this command. Now a long time passed, and the king's daughters grew up and became the most beautiful maidens of whom one has ever heard tell. Then war broke out, and the king, their father, had to leave them. One day, while he was away at war, the 3 princesses were sitting in the window and looking out, watching the sun shine on the little flowers in the garden, and they felt a great desire to play with the lovely flowers, and begged their guards to let them go into the garden for a little while. But this their guards would not allow, for they feared the king's anger. Yet the king's daughters pleaded so very sweetly that they could not deny their pleas, and they let them have their way. But the princesses did not have long to walk about, for no sooner were they beneath the open sky than a cloud came suddenly down and bore them off, and all attempts to regain possession of them were fruitless, though search was made in every direction. Then the whole kingdom mourned and grieved, and one may imagine that the king was anything but happy when he returned home and learned all that had happened. Yet what is done cannot be undone, and in the end they had to resign themselves to it. And since the king knew of no other way to help himself, he had proclaimed throughout the kingdom that whoever would deliver his 3 daughters out of the power of the mountain troll should have one of them for his bride, and with her half of the kingdom. When this became known in foreign lands, many youths set forth with horses and followers to seek the princesses. At the king's court were 2 princes who also went forth to see whether fortune would be kind to them. They armed themselves in the best possible way with coats of mail and costly weapons, and bragged and boasted that they would not return without having done what they set out to do. And now, We will let the king's sons ride out over the world on their quest, while we turn to other people. Far, far out in the wild wood there lived a poor widow, who had an only son who drove his mother's pigs to pasture every day. And as he crossed the fields, he whittled himself a flute and amused himself playing it. And he played so sweetly that he warmed the cockles of the hearts of all those who heard him. Now, it chanced that the young swineherd once sat in the wood blowing his flute, while his 3 pigs were digging under the pine roots. And an old man came along with a beard so long and so broad that it hung far below his girdle. The old man had a large, powerful dog with him. When the youth saw the great dog, he thought to himself, if a fellow had a dog like that to keep him company here in the wilderness, he might consider himself lucky. And when the old man noticed this, he began, "That is why I have come, for I want to exchange my dog for one of your pigs." The youth was at once willing and closed the bargain. He received the great dog and gave up the grey pig in place of it. Then the old man went his way, but as he left he said, "You have reason to be satisfied with our exchange, for that dog is not like other dogs. His name is Take Hold, and whatever you tell him to take hold of, he will seize, even though it were the grimmest of trolls." Thereupon they parted, and the youth thought that fortune had indeed favoured him. In the evening he called his dog and drove his pigs home. But when his old mother heard that he had given away the grey pig for a dog, she was angry beyond measure, and gave her son a good drubbing. The youth told her to calm herself, but all in vain. The longer it lasted, the more furious she became. Then, since he did not know what else to do, he called out to his dog, "Take hold!" At once the dog ran up, seized the old mother, and held her so tightly that she could not move. But otherwise he did her no harm, and now she had to promise her son to make the best of the matter, and then they were friends once more. The following day the youth went to the wood again with his dog and the 2 pigs. After a time he sat down and played his flute as usual, and the dog danced to his playing with such skill that it was nothing short of a miracle. And as he was sitting there, the old man with the grey beard came out of the wood again, and with him another dog, no smaller than the first. When the youth saw the handsome beast, he thought to himself, "If a fellow had that dog to keep him company here, where it is so lonely, he need have no fear." When the old man noticed this, he began, "That is why I have come, for I want to exchange my dog for one of your pigs." The youth did not lose any time, but agreed to close the bargain. He received the great dog and gave up one of his pigs in place of it. Then the old man went his way. Yet before he left he added, "You have reason to be well satisfied with your purchase, for this dog is not like the other dogs. His name is Tear, and if you give him something to tear, he will tear it to pieces, even though it were the grimmest of trolls." Then they parted. But the youth was happy in the idea that he had made a capital exchange, although he knew that his old mother would not be content with it. And when evening came, and the youth went home, his old mother was no less angry than she had been before. But this time she did not venture to beat her son, because she was afraid of the great dogs. Yet, as is usual, when women have scolded long enough, they stop of their own accord, and that is what happened in this case. The youth and his mother made peace with each other, though the mother thought to herself that the damage done could not well be repaired. On the 3rd day, the youth went into the wood again with his pig and 2 dogs. He felt very happy, seated himself on a tree stump, and played his flute as usual. And the dogs danced to his playing with such skill that it was a pleasure to watch them. As the youth was sitting there in peace and quiet, the old grey beard once more came out of the wood. This time he had a 3rd dog with him, who was as large as both the others together. When the youth saw the handsome animal, he could not help but think, If a fellow had this dog to keep him company in the wilderness, he would have no cause for complaint. The old man at once began, "That is why I have come, in order to sell my dog, for I can see you would like to have him." The youth was at once willing and agreed to close the bargain. So he received the great dog and gave up his last pig in place of it. Then the old man went his way. Yet before he went, he said, "You will be satisfied with your exchange, for this dog is not like other dogs. His name is Hark, and his hearing is so keen that he hears everything that happens, though it be happening many miles away. He even hears the grass and the trees grow." Then they parted in the friendliest spirit, but the youth was happy in the thought that now he need fear nothing in the world. And then when evening came on, and the swineherd went home, his mother was very sad to think that her son had sold all they possessed. But the youth told her to be of good courage, since he would see to it that they did not suffer want. And when he spoke to her in such a cheerful manner, she grew content again, and decided that he had spoken in wise and manly fashion. Then when day dawned, the youth went hunting with his dogs, and came back at evening with as much game as he could possibly carry, and he continued to go hunting in this way for a time, until his old mother's storeroom was well provided with meat and all sorts of good things. Then he bade his mother a fond farewell, called his dogs, and said he was going to wander out into the world and try his fortune. And he fared forth over mountains and tangled ways, and came into the heart of a sombre forest. There he met the grey beard of whom I have already told you, and when he met him, the youth was much pleased, and said, "Good day, grandfather, and thanks for the last time." And the old man replied, "Good day to you, and—" "Whither away?" the youth answered. "I am wandering out into the world to see what fortune has in store for me." Then the old man said, "Keep right on going till you come to the royal castle, and there your fortune will take a turn." And with that they parted. The youth followed the old man's advice, and for a time wandered on straight ahead. When he came to a tavern, he played his flute and let his dogs dance, and was never at a lack for bed and board, and whatever else he might want. After he had wandered long and far, he at length came to a great city, whose streets were filled with people. The youth wondered what it all meant, and at last reached the spot where, to the sound of bell, the king's proclamation was being cried that whoever should deliver the 3 princesses out of the power of the troll would receive one of them, and half the kingdom as well. Now he understood what the old man had meant. He called his dogs and went to the king's castle, but there all had been grief and mourning since the day the king's daughters had disappeared, and of them all the king and queen were the most sorrowful. Then the youth went to the keeper of the door and asked him whether he might play and show his dogs before the king. The courtiers were willing, for they hoped it might make him feel more cheerful. So he was admitted and allowed to show his tricks. And when the king had heard him play, and had seen the skilful dancing of his dogs, he grew quite merry, and none had seen him as happy during all the 7 long years that had passed since he had lost his daughters. When the dance was over, the king asked the youth what he asked as a reward for having given him such a pleasure. The youth answered, "My lord king, I did not come to you to win gold and gear, but I have another request to make, that you allow me to set out and search for your 3 daughters, carried away by a mountain troll." When the king heard this, his thoughts once more grew gloomy, and he replied, "You need not even think of delivering my daughters. It is no child's play, and your betters have already attempted it in vain. Yet should it really come to pass that you deliver one of the princesses, You may be sure that I will not break my word." So he took leave of the king and set forth. And he decided to take no rest until he had found what he sought. Now he passed through many broad kingdoms without meeting with any special adventures, and wherever he went his dogs followed him. Hark! Ran along and listened for anything worth hearing to be heard around them. Take hold! Carried his master's knapsack and tear. Who was the strongest? Carried his master when the latter was weary. One day, Hark came running up hastily and told his master that he had gone to a high mountain, and had heard the king's daughter, who sat within it and span, and that the troll was not at home. This greatly pleased the youth, and he hurried toward the mountain together with his 3 dogs. When they got there, Hark said, "There is no time to lose. The troll is only 10 miles away, and I can already hear the golden horseshoes of his steed ringing on the stones." The youth now ordered his dogs to break down the door into the mountain, and they did. And as he stepped into the mountain, he saw a lovely maiden sitting in the mountain hall, winding a golden thread on a golden spindle. The youth went up and greeted the lovely girl. Then the king's daughter was much surprised and said, "Who are you that dare to venture into the giant's hall? During all the 7 long years I have been sitting here in the mountain, I have never yet seen a human being." And she added, "For heaven's sake, hasten away before the troll returns home, or else your life will be forfeit." But the youth was unafraid, and said that he would await the giant's return without fear. While they were talking together, the giant came riding along on his coat shod with gold. When he saw the gate standing open, he grew furiously angry and shouted till the whole mountain shook, "Who has broken my mountain door?" The youth boldly answered, "I did, and now I shall break you as well. Take hold, seize him, tear, and hark, tear him into 1,000 pieces." No sooner had he spoken than the dogs rushed up, fell upon the giant, and tore him into countless pieces. Then the princess was happy beyond measure, and said, "God be praised, now I am freed." And she fell upon the youth's neck and gave him a kiss. But he did not wish to stay there any longer, saddled the giant's coat, loaded it with all the gold and gear he found in the mountain, and hastily went away with the king's beautiful daughter. They passed on together a long distance. Then, one day, Hark, who always ran ahead scouting, came quickly back to his master and told him he had been near a high mountain, and had heard the king's 2nd daughter sitting within it winding golden yarn, and that the troll himself was not at home. This was very welcome news for the youth, and he hurried toward the mountain with his faithful dogs. Now when they drew near, Hark said, "There is no time to lose. The giant is only 8 miles away, and I can already hear the golden horseshoes of his steed ringing on the stones." The youth at once ordered his dogs to break down the door into the mountain, no matter which way. And when he stepped into the interior of the mountain, he saw a lovely maiden sitting in the mountain hall, winding golden yarn on a golden windle. The youth went up and greeted the lovely girl. The king's daughter was much surprised and said, "Who are you that dare to venture into the giant's hall? During all the 7 years I have been sitting here in the mountain, I have never yet seen a human being." And she added, "For heaven's sake, hasten away, for if the troll comes, your life will be forfeit." But the youth told her why he had come, and said that he would await the troll's return quite undisturbed. While they were still talking together, the giant came riding on his steed shod with gold and drew up outside the mountain. When he noticed that the great door was open, he grew furiously angry and shouted till the mountain trembled to its very roots. He said, "Who has broken my mountain door?" The youth boldly answered, "I have, and now I shall break you as well." take hold, seize him, tear, and hark, tear him into 1,000 pieces." The dogs at once rushed up, threw themselves upon the giant, and tore him into as many pieces as leaves fall in the autumn. Then the king's daughter was happy beyond measure and cried, "God be praised! Now I am freed!" And she fell upon the youth's neck and gave him a kiss. But he led the princess to her sister, and one can imagine how glad they were to see each other again. Then the youth packed up all the treasures he found in the mountain hall, loaded them on the giant's steed, and went his way with the king's 2 daughters, and they wandered along for a long time. Then, one day, Hark, who always ran ahead scouting, came hastily to his master and told him that he had been near a high mountain, and had heard the king's 3rd daughter sitting within and weaving a web of gold, and that the troll was not at home. This was very welcome news for the youth, and he hastened toward the mountain, followed by his 3 dogs. When he drew near, "Hark!" said, "There is no time to lose, for the giant is only 5 miles away. I can already hear the golden horseshoes of his steed ringing on the stones." Then the youth at once ordered his dogs to break down the door into the mountain, by hook or by crook. And when he stepped into the mountain, he saw a girl sitting in the mountain hall weaving a web of gold. But this maiden was lovely beyond all measure, with a loveliness exceeding all the youth had ever thought to find on earth. He now went up and greeted the lovely maiden. Then the king's daughter was much surprised and said, "Who are you that dare to venture into the giant's hall? During all the 7 long years I have been sitting here in the mountain, I have never yet seen a human being." And she added, "For heaven's sake, hasten away before the troll comes, or else your life will be forfeit." But the youth was full of confidence, and said he would gladly venture his life for the king's lovely daughter. While they were still talking, the giant came riding along on his colt shod with gold, and drew up at the foot of the mountain. When he went in, he saw that uninvited guests had arrived, and was much frightened, for well he knew of the fate that had befallen his brothers. He therefore thought it advisable to fall back upon cunning and treachery, for he had not dared to venture on open battle. For that reason he made many fine speeches, and was very friendly and smooth with the youth. Then he told the king's daughter to prepare a meal in order to show his guest all hospitality. And since the troll knew so well how to talk, the youth allowed himself to be beguiled by his smooth words, and forgot to be on his guard. He sat down to the table with the giant, but the king's daughter wept secretly, and the dogs were very restless, though no one paid them any attention. When the giant and his guest had finished their meal, the youth said, "Now that I have satisfied my hunger, give me something to quench my thirst." The giant replied, "On the mountain top is a spring in which bubbles the clearest wine, but I have no one to fetch it." The youth answered, "If that be all that is lacking, one of my dogs can go up." Then the giant laughed in his false heart, for nothing suited him better than to have the youth send away his dogs. The youth ordered, "Take hold," to go to the spring, and the giant handed him a great tankard. The dog went, yet it was easy to see that he did not go willingly, and the time passed, and he did not return. After a while the giant said, "I wonder why your dog stays away so long. Perhaps you would let another of your dogs go and help him, for the way is long, and the tankard is heavy." The youth did not suspect any trickery, and agreed. He told Tear to go and see why Take Hold had not yet come. The dog wagged his tail and did not want to leave his master, but the youth did not notice it and drove him off himself. Then the giant laughed heartily, and the king's daughter wept, yet the youth paid no attention, but was merry and at his ease, played with his sword, and dreamed of no danger. Thus a long time passed, but nothing was heard of the wine, nor of the dogs. Then the giant said, "I can see that your dogs do not do as you bid them, otherwise we should not have to sit here and thirst. I think it would be well if you let Hark go up and see why they do not come back." The youth agreed and told his third dog to hurry to the spring. But Hark did not want to, and instead crept whining to his master's feet. Then the youth grew angry and drove him off by force. And when he reached the top of the mountain, he shared the fate of the others. A high wall rose round about him, and he was made a prisoner by the giant's magic power. Now that all 3 dogs were gone, the giant rose, and suddenly looked altogether different. He took down a long sword from the wall and said, "Now I will do what my brothers did not do, and you must die at once, for you are in my power." Then the youth was frightened, and he regretted he had allowed his dogs to leave him. He said, "I do not ask for my life, since in any event the time will come when I must die. But I would like to repeat the Lord's Prayer and play a psalm on my flute, for such is the custom in my country." The giant granted his prayer, but said that he would not wait long. So the youth kneeled and began to blow his flute till it sounded over hill and dale. And that very moment the magic wall was broken and the dogs were freed. They came rushing on like the storm wind and fell upon the mountain troll. The youth at once rose and said, "Take hold, seize him, tear, and hark, tear him into 1,000 pieces." Then the dogs flung themselves on the giant and tore him into countless pieces. Then the youth took all the treasures that lay in the mountain, hitched the giant's horses to a gilded wagon, and drove off as fast as he could. Now when the king's daughters met again, there was great joy, as may well be imagined, and all thanked the youth for delivering them out of the power of the mountain trolls. But the youth fell deeply in love with the youngest princess, and they promised to be true to each other. So the king's daughters passed on their way with music and merriment of every kind, and the youth served them with all the honour and courtesy due maidens of gentle birth. And while they were under way, the princesses toyed with the youth's hair, and each tied her golden ring in his locks for remembrance. One day, while they were still under way, they met 2 wanderers who were travelling the same road. The clothes of the 2 strangers were torn, and their feet were sore, and their whole appearance showed that they had a long journey behind them. The youth stopped his wagon and asked them who they were and whence they came. The strangers answered that they were 2 princes and had gone forth to search for the 3 maidens in the mountain. But fortune had not favoured them, and now they had to return home more like journeymen than king's sons. When the youth heard this, he felt sorry for the 2 wanderers and asked whether they would like to ride with him in his handsome wagon. The princes thanked him profusely for his offer. They drove on together and came to the kingdom over which the father of the princesses reigned. Now, when the princes learned that the youth had delivered the king's 3 daughters, a great jealousy took possession of them, and they thought of how badly they had fared in their own venture. And they took counsel together as to how they might get the better of the youth and win power and glory for themselves. But they hid their evil plot till a favourable opportunity offered for carrying it out. Then they suddenly threw themselves on their comrade, seized him by the throat and strangled him, and then they threatened to kill the princesses if they did not swear to keep silence. And since the king's daughters were in the power of the princes, they did not dare say no. But they felt very sorry for the youth who had given up his life for them, and the youngest princess mourned with all her heart, and all her happiness was at an end. After this great wrong, the princes drove to the royal castle, and one may well imagine how happy the king was to get back his 3 daughters. In the meantime, the poor youth lay like dead off in a gorge in the forest. Yet he was not quite dead, and his faithful dogs lay about him, kept him warm and licked his wounds. And they did not stop until their master came back to life again. When he was once more well and strong, he set out, and, after many difficulties, came to the royal castle in which the princesses dwelt. When he came in, the whole court was full of joy and merriment, and from the king's hall came the sound of dancing and string music. That surprised him greatly, and he asked what it all meant. The serving man answered, "You must come from far away, since you do not know that the king has regained his daughters who were in the power of the mountain troll. This is the oldest princess's wedding day." The youth then asked after the youngest princess, and when she was to marry, but the serving man said that she did not want a husband, and wept the live-long day, though no one knew why. Then the youth felt happy once more, for now he knew that she loved him, and had kept faith with him. The youth now went to the keeper of the door, and bade him tell the king that a guest had arrived who would add to the merriment of the wedding festivities by showing his dogs. This was to the king's liking, and he ordered that the stranger receive the best possible treatment. And when the youth stepped into the hall, the whole wedding company were astounded by his skill and his manly bearing, and all agreed that so handsome a youth was rarely seen. But no sooner had the king's 3 daughters recognized him than they jumped up from the table and flung themselves on his neck. And then the princes thought it best to make themselves scarce. But the king's daughters told how the youth had freed them, and the rest of their adventures, and to make quite certain, they looked for their rings among his locks. Now, when the king heard of the trickery and treachery the 2 strange princes had used, he grew very angry and had them driven ignominiously forth from the castle. But he received the brave youth with great honour, as he had deserved, and he was married to the king's youngest daughter that self-same day. After the king's death, the youth was chosen king of all the land, and a gallant king he was. And there he lives with his beautiful queen, and is reigning there happily to this very day. And that is all I have to do with it. Once upon a time there was a peasant who led his cow to pasture in the spring and prayed God to have her in his care. The evil one was sitting in a bush, heard him, and said to himself, "When things turn out well, they thank God for it, but if anything goes wrong, then I am always to blame." A few days later, the cow strayed into a swamp, and when the peasant came and saw her, he said, "Look at that! The devil has had his finger in the pie again." "Just what I might have expected," thought the devil in his bush. Then the peasant went off to fetch people to help drag the cow out. But in the meantime, the devil slipped from his bush and helped out the cow, for he thought, "Now he will have something to thank me for too." But when the peasant came back and saw the cow on dry land, he said, "Thank God." How Smaland and Schonen came to be. The Smalanders declare, at the time when our Lord created the earth, he made a level and fruitful stretch of land, and that was Schonen. But the devil had been busy in the meantime, and had created Smaland, a barren region consisting mainly of hills and swamps. When our Lord saw it, it looked very hopeless to him, and he strewed the bits of earth that remained in his apron out over it, and created the Smalanders. They turned out to be a fine race of men, handsome and strong and able to take care of themselves in any situation. It is said to this very day that if you take a Smalander and set him down on a rock in the sea, he will still manage to save himself. But in the meantime, the devil had been down in Schonen and had created the people who live there, and that is why they are so slow, boastful, and servile. but the people of Schonen say once as our Lord and St. Peter were walking together, they heard a terrible commotion in a forest. "Go see what is happening there," said our Lord. St. Peter went, and there was the devil and a Smalander, who were pummeling each other with might and main. St. Peter tried to separate them, but they paid no attention to him. So he took his sword and chopped off both their heads. And he told our Lord what he had seen and done. "No, that was not well done," the latter replied. "Go and put back their heads where they were, and touch the wounds with your sword, and both will come to life again." Saint Peter did so, but he exchanged heads. Since that time, the Smalanders all have a bit of the devil about them, and those who know the devil will tell you that he is more or less like the Smalanders. The Evil One and Kitta Grau. One day the devil met Kitta Grau. "Where have you been, old man?" asked Kitta Grau, for she recognized him. "Well," said the Evil One, "I have been out on the farmstead where the newly wedded couple live. This is the third time I have tried to sow dissension between them, but they think so much of each other that it is a sheer impossibility. You talk like a real stupid." "That is something I could bring about the very first time I went there," said Kitta Grau. "If you can do that, you shall have a splendid pair of shoes," was the Evil One's reply. "Mind you keep your word," said Kitta, and turned toward the farmstead. There the woman was home alone, for her husband had gone to the forest. Kitta said to the young wife, "You really have a splendid husband." "And that is the truth," the woman replied, "for he grants my every wish before it is spoken." "But take my word for it," said Kitta, "there is still a bit of deceit in him. He has a pair of long hairs under his chin. If you could get at them with a razor and cut them off while he is asleep, then he would be altogether without malice." "Well," said the woman, "if that will help, I will be sure to keep an eye open after dinner and attend to it, for then he always takes a little noonday nap." Then Kitta Grau went out into the forest to the husband and bade him good day. "You really have a very good wife," said Kitta. "She could not be bettered," replied the husband. "Well, you might be mistaken for all that," said Kitta. "When you come home, be on your guard, for when you go to take your noonday nap, she has in mind to cut your throat. So be sure not to go to sleep." The husband did not think much of the matter, but still he thanked Kitta Grau for her trouble. Then he went home and ate his dinner, laid down, and pretended to fall asleep at once. Thereupon his wife went to his shaving kit, took out his razor, went softly up to him and took hold of his chin with her hand. Up flew the man. "Do you want to murder me?" he cried, and gave his wife such a thump that she measured her full length on the floor. And from that day forward there was no peace in the house. Now Kitta Grau was to receive her reward from the Evil One, but he was so afraid of her that he did not venture to give her the shoes until he stood on one side of a stream while she stood on the other, and then he passed them over to her on a long pole. "You are ever so much worse than I am," he told Kitta Grau. The black man had made a bargain with a merchant. He had promised him that all goods which he might buy he should sell again within 3 weeks, time at a handsome profit. But if he had prospered, after 7 years had passed, he was to be the devil's own. And he did prosper, for no matter what manner of old trash the merchant bought, and if it were no more than an old worn-out fur coat, he was always able to sell it again, and always at a profit. Kitta Grau came into his shop and showed him the handsome shoes the Evil One had given her. So the merchant said, "May heaven keep me from him. He will surely fetch me when the time comes, for I have made a pact with him, and I have been unable to buy anything without selling it again in 3 weeks' time." Then Kitta Grau said, "Buy me, for I am sure no one will buy me from you." And that is what the merchant did. He bought Kitta, had her disrobe and cover herself with tar, and roll in a pile of feathers. Then he put her in a glass cage as though she were a bird. Now the first week went by, and the second week went by, and the third week went by, and no one appeared who wanted to buy the curious bird. And then, in due time, came the evil one, and wanted to fetch his merchant. "Have patience," said the merchant. "I still have something I have bought, but have not been able to sell again in 3 weeks' time." "That is something I'd like to see," said the black man. Then the merchant showed him Kitta Grau, sitting in her glass cage. But no sooner had the evil one seen the handsome bird than he cried, "Oh, I see. It is you, Kitta Grau. No one who knows you would buy you." And with that he hurried on his way. Thus Kitta Grau could help do evil and help do good. The Lady of Pintorp, where today a castellate building towers between spreading parks and gardens on the noble estate of Eriksberg. There lay in ancient times a holding known as Pintorp, with which legend has associated the gruesome tale of the Lady of Pintorp. In Pintorp, so the legend says, there dwelt a nobleman who, dying in his youth, left all his goods and gear to his widow. Yet instead of being a kind mistress to her many dependents, she exploited them in every way, and ill-treated them shamefully. Beneath her castle she had deep subterranean dungeons, in which languished many innocent people. She set vicious dogs at children and beggars, and if anyone did not come to work at the right time, he was sure to go home in the evening with wheels on his back. Once, early in the morning, when the men came to work, the Lady of Pintorp was standing on the castle steps and saw a poor farmhand belonging to the estate come too late. Foaming with rage, she overwhelmed him with abuse and reproaches, and ordered him to chop down the largest oak on the whole estate, and bring it, crown foremost, to the castle court before evening. And if he did not carry out her command to the very letter, so she said she would drive him from his hut without mercy, and all that he had should fall to the estate. With heavy thoughts of the severe judgment passed upon him, the farmhand went to the wood, and there he met an old man who asked him why he was so unhappy. "Because it is all up with me, if our Lord in his mercy do not help me," sighed the unfortunate man, and told of the task his mistress had imposed on him. "Do not worry," said the unknown. "Chop down this oak, seat yourself on the trunk, and Erik, Gyllenstierna, and Svante Banar will take it to the castle." The farmhand did as the old man told him, began to hew to the line, and sure enough, at the third stroke the tree fell with a tremendous crash. Then he seated himself on the trunk, facing the crown, and at once the tree began to move, as though drawn by horses. Soon it rushed along so swiftly that posts and garden palings flew out of the way like splinters, and soon they had reached the castle. At the moment the tree-top struck the castle gate, one of the invisible bearers stumbled, and a voice was heard saying, "What? Are you falling on your knees, Svante?" The Lady of Pintorp, who was standing on the steps, knew well who was helping the man, yet instead of feeling regret, she began to curse and scold, and finally threatened to imprison the farmhand. Then the earth quaked so that the walls of the castle shook, and a black coach, drawn by 2 black horses, stopped before the castle. A fine gentleman, clad in black, descended from the coach, bowed to the lady, and bade her make ready and follow him. Trembling, for she knew well who the stranger must be, she begged for a 3 years' respite, but the black gentleman would not grant her request. Then she asked for 3 months, and that he refused as well. Finally she begged for 3 weeks, and then for 3 days, but only 3 minutes were allowed her to put her house in order, When she saw there was no help for it, she begged that at least her chaplain, her chambermaid, and her valet be allowed to accompany her. This request was granted, and they entered the carriage. The horses at once started off, and the carriage drove away so swiftly that the people at the castle saw no more than a black streak. When the woman and her companions had thus driven a while, they came to a splendid castle, and the gentleman in black led them up the steps. Above, in the great hall, the woman laid off her costly garments and put on a coarse coat and wooden shoes. Then he combed her hair 3 times till she could no longer bear it, and danced with her 3 times until she was exhausted. After the first dance, the lady begged to be allowed to give her golden ring to her valet, and it burned his finger like fire. After the second dance, she gave her chambermaid her bunch of keys, and that seared the girl's hand like red-hot iron. But after the third dance, a trapdoor opened in the floor, and the lady disappeared in a cloud of smoke and flame. The chaplain, who was standing nearest her, looked down curiously into the opening into which his mistress had sunk, and a spark shot up from the depths and flew into his eye, so that he was blind in one eye for the rest of his life. When it was all over, the black gentleman allowed the servitors to drive home again, but expressly forbade them to look around. They hastily entered the coach. The road was broad and even, and the horses ran rapidly. But when they had gone a while, the chambermaid could no longer control her curiosity, and looked around. That very minute, horses, coach, and the road itself were gone. The travellers found themselves in a wild forest, and it cost them 3 years to get out again and make their way back to Pintorp. The Specter in Fjelkinge during the first half of the 18th century, several large estates in Schonen were the property of the family of Barnekow, or rather, of its most distinguished representative at that time, Margaret Barnekow, daughter of the famous captain and governor-general Count Rutger of Aschenberg, and the wife of Colonel Kjell Christopher Barnekow. A widow at 29, she herself took over the management of her large properties and gave therein evidence of invincible courage, an inexhaustible capacity for work, and a tireless solicitude for all her many dependents and servitors. While travelling about her estates, Madame Margaret one evening came to the tavern in Fjelkinge, and was quartered for the night in a room that had the name of being haunted. Some years before, a traveller had lain in the same room and presumably had been murdered. At any rate, the man himself and all his belongings had disappeared without leaving a trace, and the mystery had never been explained. Since that time, the room had been haunted, and those who knew about it preferred to travel a post station further in the dark, rather than pass the night in the room in question. But Margaret Barnekow did not do so. She had already shown greater courage in greater contingencies, and chose this particular room to sleep in without any fear. She let the lamp burn and fell asleep after she had said her evening prayer. On the stroke of 12 she awoke, just as some planks were raised in the floor, and up rose a bleeding phantom whose head, split wide open, hung down on his shoulder. "Noble lady," whispered the spectre, "prepare a grave in consecrated earth for a murdered man, and deliver his murderer to the judgment which is his due." God-fearing and unafraid, Madame Margaret beckoned the phantom nearer, and he told her he had already addressed the same prayer to various other people, but that none had had the courage to grant it. Then Madame Margaret drew a gold ring from her finger, laid it on the gaping wound, and tied up the head of the murdered man with her kerchief. With a glance of unspeakable gratitude he told her the murderer's name, and disappeared beneath the floor without a sound. The following morning, Madame Margaret sent for the sheriff of the district to come to the tavern with some of his people, informed him of what had happened to her during the night, and ordered those present to tear up the floor. And there they found, buried in the earth, the remains of a body and, in a wound in its head, the Countess's ring, and tied about its head a kerchief. One of the bystanders grew pale at the sight, and fell senseless to the ground. When he came to his senses, he confessed that he had murdered the traveller and robbed him of his belongings. He was condemned to death for his crime, and the body of the murdered man was buried in the village churchyard. The ring, of peculiar shape, and its setting bearing a large grey stone, is still preserved in the Barnacle family, and magic virtues in cases of sickness, fire, and other misfortunes are ascribed to it. And when one of the barnacles dies, it is said that a red spot, like a drop of blood, appears on the stone. The Rooster, the hand mill and a swarm of hornets. Once upon a time there was a peasant who wanted to go to sell a pig. After he had gone a while, he met a man who asked him where he was going with his pig. "I want to sell it," answered the peasant, "but I do not know what to do to get rid of it." "Go to the devil," said the man. "He will be the first to rid you of it." So the peasant kept on along the broad highway. When he came to the devil's place, there stood a man out by the woodpile making wood. The peasant went to him and asked whether he could tell him if they wanted to buy a pig in the devil's place. "I'll go in and ask," said the man, "if you will make wood in my stead while I am gone." "Yes, I will do that gladly," said the peasant, took the axe, stood at the woodpile, and began to make wood. And he worked and worked until evening came, but the man did not return to tell him whether they would or would not buy a pig in the devil's place. At length another man came that way, and the peasant asked him whether he would make wood in his stead, for it was impossible to lay down the axe unless another took it up and went on working. So the man took the axe and stood there making wood, and the peasant went into the devil's place himself and asked whether anyone wanted to buy a pig. A crowd as large as that at a fair at once gathered, and all wanted to buy the pig. Then the peasant thought, "Whoever pays the most gets it." And one would overbid another, offering far more than a whole herd of pigs were worth. But at last a gentleman came along who whispered something to the peasant, and told him to come along with him, and he could have all the money he wanted. So, when they had reached the gentleman's house, and the peasant had given him the pig, he received in payment a rooster who would lay silver coins as often as he was told to do so. Then the peasant went his way, well content with his bargain. But on the way home he stayed overnight at a tavern kept by an old woman, and he was so exceedingly happy about his splendid rooster that he had to boast about him to the old woman, and show her how he went about laying silver coins. And at night, when the peasant was fast asleep, the old woman came and took away his rooster, and put another in its place. No sooner did the peasant awake in the morning than he wanted to set his rooster to work. "Lay quickly, rooster of mine. Lay big silver coins, my rooster." But the rooster could lay no silver coins at all, and only answered, "Kikeriki, kikeriki, kikeriki." Then the peasant fell into a rage, wandered back to the devil's place, complained about the rooster, and told how absolutely worthless he was. He was kindly received, and the same gentleman gave him a hand mill, when he called out, "Mill, grind," to it. It would grind as much meal as he wanted it to, and would not stop until he said, "Mill, stop grinding." And the mill would grind out every kind of meal for which he asked. When the peasant set out for home, he reached the same tavern at which he had already put up in the evening, so he turned in and decided to stay overnight. He was so pleased with the mill that it was impossible for him to hold his tongue. So he told the old woman what a valuable mill he had, and showed her how it worked. But during the night, while he was asleep, The old woman came and stole his mill and put another in its place. When the peasant awoke in the morning, he was in a great hurry to test his mill, but he could not make it obey. "Mill, grind!" he cried, but the mill stood still. Then he said, "Dear mill, grind wheat meal," but it had no effect. "Then grind rye meal," he shouted, but that did not help either. "Well then, grind peas." But the mill did not seem to hear, but stood as still as though it had never turned a single time in all its life. Then the peasant took the road back to the devil's place again, and at once hunted up the gentleman who had purchased his pig, and told him the mill would grind no more meal. "Do not grieve about that," said the gentleman, and gave him a large hornet's nest full of hornets, who flew out in swarms and stung anyone whom they were told to sting, until one said, "Stop," to them. Now when the peasant again came to the old woman, he told her he had a swarm of hornets who obeyed his commands. "Heavens above," cried the woman, "that's something worthwhile seeing." "You may see it without any trouble," replied the peasant, and at once called, "Out, out, my hornets, and sting the old woman." And at once the entire swarm fell upon the old woman, who began to scream pitifully. She begged the peasant to please call back his hornets, and said she was only too willing to give back the rooster and the mill she had taken. The peasant did not object to this, but ordered his hornets to leave the old woman alone and fly back into their house. Then he went home with his rooster, his mill, and his hornets, became a rich man, and lived happily until he died. And he was in the habit of saying, "They have a big fair in the devil's place, and you find real decent people there, and above all a liberal gentleman with whom it is a pleasure to do business." Torre Jeppe. In a church nave a spectre sat night by night, and the spectre's name was Torre Jeppe. He was a dried-up corpse that could not decay. One night 3 tailors were working at a farmstead in the neighborhood. They were laughing and joking, and among other things they asked the girl in the house, who was known to be brave, what they would have to give her to go to church and fetch back Torre Jeppe. She could trust herself to do it, was her answer, but they must give her a dress of homespun wool for her trouble. That she should surely have, said the tailors, for they did not believe the girl would dare such a venture. Yet she took the tailors at their word and really went. When she reached the church, she took Torre Jeppe on her back, carried him home, and sat him down on the bench beside the tailors. They timidly moved away, but Torre Jeppe moved after them, and looked at them with his big eyes until they nearly lost their reason. In their terror they begged the girl in the name of God to deliver them from the spectre. They would gladly give her another dress if she would only carry the dead man away again. They had no need to tell her twice, for she took Torre Jeppe on her back and dragged him away again. But when she tried to set him down in the place where she had found him, he did not want to let her go, but clasped his arms firmly about her neck. In vain she said to him several times, "Torre Jeppe, let me go." At last he said, "I will not let you go until you promise me that you will go this very night to the brook and ask 3 times, 'Anna Postokter, do you forgive Torre Jeppe?'" The girl promised to do as he said, and he at once released her. The brook was a good mile off, but she went there and asked 3 times in a loud voice, as she had promised, "Anna Postokter, do you forgive Torre Jeppe?" And when she had called the 3rd time, a woman's voice replied from out of the water, "If God has forgiven him, then I, too, forgive him." When the girl came back to the church, Torre Jeppe asked eagerly, "What did she say?" "Well, if God has forgiven you, then she, too, will forgive you." Then Torre Jeppe thanked her and said, Come back again before sunrise, and you shall receive your reward for the service you have done me." The girl went back at sunrise, and in the place where the phantom had been sitting, she found a bushel of silver coin. In addition, she received the 2 dresses promised her by the tailors. But Torre Jeppe was never seen again. XXX. The man who died on Holy, in Notion's day. Once upon a time, there was a man named Caligula. He was a wild fellow, and had committed many a grievous crime during his life. When he came to die, and his wife took up the Bible to pray for him as he was lying there, he said, "No, this is Holy Innocents' Day, and it is not worthwhile reading from the Bible for me. You had better go into the kitchen instead and bake waffles. I shall die this very day, and then you must lay a bundle of waffles in my coffin." The woman went into the kitchen and baked the waffles, but when she came back to him again, he was dead. So Caligula was laid in the coffin with a bundle of waffles beside him. Then he came to the gates of paradise with his little bundle of waffles under his arm and knocked. But St. Peter said to him, "You have no business here, with all the crimes you have committed." "Yes, that may well be so, but I died on Holy Innocents' Day," said Caligula, "so at least I may look in and see the innocent children." St. Peter could not refuse him, and opened the door a little way. Caligula took advantage of the moment and cried, "Come, you little holy innocents, you shall have waffles." And as they had not been given any waffles in paradise, they all came rushing up, so that the door flew wide open, and then Caligula crept in. But St. Peter went to our Lord, told him what had happened, and asked what was to be done. "The best thing is to let your lawyer attend to it," said our Lord, "because lawyers usually know all about evicting people." St. Peter searched everywhere, but could not find a lawyer. Then he went back to our Lord and reported to him that it was impossible to find a single lawyer in all paradise, and Caligula was allowed to remain where he was. If you tie a thief and a miller and a lawyer together and roll the whole bundle down a hill, no matter how you roll it, you can always be sure that whoever is on top is a thief.